Somme River Valley, France, July 1916. In the blood-soaked trenches of the Western Front, medics whisper of an ancient ambulance that appears in the fog, promising salvation to the dying. But there's something wrong with the orderlies' faces beneath their caps, and the wounded who board that vehicle are never logged in any hospital register. They simply cease to exist. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale that proves sometimes death itself isn't the most terrifying fate that awaits the wounded in no man's land. The Battle of the Somme devoured men by the thousands. In the first hour alone, the British Army suffered 30,000 casualties. For the stretcher bearers and field medics, it was a descent into hell. They crawled through mud and barbed wire under constant fire, making impossible choices about who might live long enough to reach the aid stations. The sound of the wounded crying out for their mothers echoed across no man's land, mixing with the thunder of endless artillery. Sergeant David Cooper of the Royal Army Medical Corps had seen 3 years of war, but nothing prepared him for the Somme. His field diary, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, captures the growing horror of those first weeks. "The wounded come in faster than we can count," he wrote on July 10th. "We're running out of morphine. Sometimes all we can do is hold their hands as they die. God help me, I've started to envy the dead. At least their suffering ends." But as summer faded into autumn, bringing thick evening fogs rolling off the Somme River, Cooper began documenting something far worse than the usual horrors of battlefield medicine. "First heard it last night," he wrote on September 15th. "A brass bell, deeper than our regulation handbells, cutting through the fog. Saw an old horse-drawn ambulance, must have been from the last century. 2 orderlies in outdated uniforms loading the wounded. Thought it strange, but we need all the help we can get." A week later, his entries took a darker turn. "None of the men picked up by that ambulance ever reached the aid stations. Checked every hospital register within 20 miles. It's as if they vanish into the fog itself. Orderlies never speak, never respond to signals. Something wrong with their faces, hidden in shadow beneath their caps. Harrison thinks they're Germans in disguise, playing some sick game. I'm not so sure. Saw one up close today through my field glasses. The uniform was French Army Medical, circa 1870, and the way it moved, Christ help me, no living man moves like that." Cooper's observations were soon corroborated by French stretcher-bearer Jean-Pierre Dubois. His official report describes following the ambulance's tracks through the mud, only to find them ending abruptly in the middle of a crater. More disturbing was his description of the wounded men's reactions. "They reach for the stretcher bearers at first," he wrote, "but when they see who's coming, I've never heard men scream like that. Some try to crawl away on shattered legs. Others beg us to shoot them rather than let that ambulance take them." The phantom ambulance of the Somme had begun its grim harvest, and the true horror was only beginning to unfold. Word spread quickly among the medical units. Captain Edward Wells of the 4th Field Ambulance Unit had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes, but the reports crossing his desk in October chilled him to the bone. Every account mentioned the same details: the antiquated ambulance, the hollow brass bell, the silent orderlies, who seemed more shadow than substance. Most disturbing were the casualty lists. Men would be logged as rescued from no man's land, only to vanish from all records. No field hospitals had any trace of them. "It's demoralizing the stretcher teams," Wells wrote in his official dispatch to headquarters. "Monroe and Phillips resigned their medical duties yesterday, requested transfer to the infantry. said they'd rather face German bullets than watch another wounded man disappear into that thing. Can't say I blame them. The sounds we hear when it takes someone. No man should die screaming like that. Private Thomas Wright of the Royal Army Medical Corps recorded his own encounter in a letter home, found unsent in his effects after his disappearance. "Dearest Mother," he wrote, "something haunts these battlefields besides the dead. Last night, I was treating a lieutenant with a stomach wound when the fog rolled in. He grabbed my arm and started praying, not for morphine, not for his family, but for me to kill him before they came. Then we heard it, that damned bell. The orderlies emerged from the mist like ghosts. Their uniforms, I recognized them from Father's old military photographs, French Medical Corps, 1870 pattern. But the brass buttons were green with age, the fabric rotting, and yet somehow still holding together. When they reached for the lieutenant, he fought like a man possessed. "Their hands!" he screamed. "Dear God, their hands are cold as the grave." I tried to intervene. We're supposed to coordinate with all medical units. But when I called out, they turned to look at me. Mother, there was nothing beneath those caps but shadow, and yet I could feel them watching. The lieutenant kept screaming as they loaded him. I followed their tracks in the mud, but they just stopped, as if the ambulance had simply ceased to exist. The letter ends there. Wright vanished 3 days later while treating casualties near Thiepval Ridge. His stretcher, medical kit, and blood-stained identifying tags were found in the mud. Of Wright himself, no trace remained. The final straw came when Sister Agnes Howard of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service reported seeing the Phantom ambulance actually collecting the dead. They were loading bodies we hadn't reached yet, she testified. Men who had died days or even weeks before. One of them sat up on the stretcher. His chest had been torn open by shell fire, but he turned and looked at me. His eyes, dear God, his eyes were full of such despair. The British High Command could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. Something was stalking their medical evacuation routes, something that had no place in their carefully organized system of battlefield medicine. But their first attempts to investigate would only lead to greater horrors. Lieutenant James Cooper of Military Intelligence approached his investigation like any other battlefield mystery. A methodical man with experience in counter-espionage, he began by cataloging every disappearance connected to the Phantom ambulance. The numbers told a chilling story. 47 men vanished without trace in October alone. Each disappeared during fog conditions. Each had been wounded, but not fatally. And each had been heard screaming about the cold before they vanished. The pattern defies rational explanation, Cooper wrote in his preliminary report. I've interviewed 38 witnesses, all reliable men with years of medical experience. Their descriptions match precisely. An 1870 French ambulance wagon, 2 silent orderlies, and a brass bell whose tone causes physical distress in all who hear it. Most disturbing are the consistent reports of the orderlies' appearance. Their uniforms show signs of extreme age and battle damage, yet they move with terrible purpose. Cooper's breakthrough came from an elderly French farmer, Henri Dubois, whose family had worked these lands since before the Franco-Prussian War. The old man's hands shook as he handed Cooper a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1870. During the Battle of St. Quentin, Dubois translated, an ambulance unit, commanded by Dr. Marcel Laurent, became trapped between armies in the fog. Rather than abandon their wounded, Laurent and his orderlies tried to evacuate through no man's land. They were never seen again. But in the years since, farmers working these fields have reported hearing a brass bell on foggy nights, followed by the screams of the dying. The investigation took a darker turn when Cooper interviewed stretcher-bearer William Hayes, who had gotten close enough to see inside the phantom ambulance. Hayes's testimony, marked restricted in military files, revealed the true horror of what awaited the wounded who were taken. The interior was lit by lanterns that gave off no light, Hayes reported, his hands trembling as he gave his statement. The wounded lay on stretchers, but they weren't dying properly. I recognized some of them, men I'd seen die days or weeks before. They were still conscious, still in agony from their wounds. One reached for me, begging me to end it. "They won't let us die," he whispered. "The doctors won't stop trying to save us." Cooper's investigation ended abruptly on November 12th. His final field report, written in increasingly agitated handwriting, suggests he had discovered something in the hospital records from 1870. Laurent's methods, he wrote, the experiments he performed trying to prolong life. The old texts speak of a ritual. Dear God, what have they done? They're still trying to save them. They're still trying to... The report ends there. Cooper was found the next morning in the aid station archives, his hair turned white, clutching a brass button from an 1870 French medical uniform. His only coherent statement before being evacuated for shell shock was a warning. They never stopped being doctors. That's what makes it so horrible. They're still trying to save everyone. Forever. After Cooper's breakdown, the British High Command needed answers. Colonel Richard Blackwood, of the Royal Engineers, was tasked with finding and destroying what they still hoped was merely an elaborate German psychological warfare operation. A veteran of colonial campaigns, Blackwood had seen his share of battlefield horrors, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what lay half-buried in a water-filled crater near Thiepval Ridge. Located target vehicle at map reference point 47.3, reads his initial field report. French ambulance wagon circa 1870, severe decay evident, wooden wheels rotted, brass fittings oxidized green with age. Vehicle appears to have been here for decades, yet, here his precise military handwriting wavers. Yet the interior shows signs of recent use. Blood on the stretchers is still wet. Sergeant Henry Ellis, an experienced field medic, was the first to examine the ambulance's medical equipment. His report reveals the grim dedication of its long-dead crew. Surgical instruments show heavy use, but no rust. Morphine bottles from 1870, still full. Most disturbing are the patient ledgers. The last entry is dated August 1870, but the ink appears fresh. It reads, "God forgive us. The wounded cry without ceasing. We cannot let them die. We must keep trying. The fog comes again." The recovery operation quickly turned nightmarish. Private Geoffrey Morton touched the brass bell, hoping to prove it was just German stagecraft. His medical report describes him screaming about endless rows of stretchers and doctors who won't stop operating before falling into catatonic shock. 3 more men were hospitalized after attempting to remove the surgical tools, each reporting the same symptoms: the sensation of being operated on by ice-cold hands while unable to lose consciousness. "The ambulance resists all attempts at movement," wrote Lieutenant Peter Walsh, the recovery team's last surviving officer. 6 horses died in their traces, trying to pull it free. Each animal's heart simply stopped, as if the cold from the vehicle reached in and squeezed. The wagon grows heavier with each attempt, as if something is holding it in place. something that doesn't want us finding what's underneath. But the most chilling discovery came when they finally managed to shift the ambulance slightly. Beneath it lay a surgical logbook, its pages somehow preserved despite decades in the mud. The entries detailed Dr. Laurent's desperate attempts to save his patients as his ambulance became trapped between armies in 1870. The writing becomes increasingly erratic, describing experimental treatments and local folklore about preserving life through supernatural means. The final entry chills the blood. The shells fall all around. We cannot move forward or back. So many wounded. They beg for morphine for death. But we are doctors. We took an oath. If this ritual works, if the old woman's words were true, we can save them all. The fog thickens. The bell tolls. God help us. We can never stop saving them now. Walsh's team tried to destroy the ambulance that night. As they prepared the explosives, a familiar sound drifted through the fog. The hollow toll of a brass bell. Through the mist, Walsh wrote, we saw them, the original crew in their rotting uniforms, still making their rounds after all these years. Their hands still reaching to help, to heal, to save. Even though their own flesh had long since withered away, we ran. God help me, we ran. By January 1917, the horror had grown beyond containment. The phantom ambulance now appeared nightly in the fog, its brass bell's hollow toll driving men to desperation. Wounded soldiers began refusing evacuation, preferring to take their chances in the mud of no man's land, rather than risk being saved by the ghostly medical team. Corporal Michael Collins, a stretcher-bearer with the Royal Army Medical Corps, documented the deteriorating situation in letters recently donated to the Imperial War Museum. The men know about the ambulance now, he wrote on January 15th. They've heard the screams of those it takes. Yesterday, I found Captain Richards with a belly wound. When he heard our stretcher team approaching, he pulled his revolver. I won't go with them, he kept saying. Let me die here. Please God, just let me die. The breaking point came during a massive German artillery barrage on January 23rd. The casualties were overwhelming, and the fog that rolled in was thick enough to choke on. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a nurse with the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, was on duty in the forward aid station when it happened. The bell sounded closer than ever before, she recorded in her official report. Then we saw him, Dr. Laurent himself, still wearing his blood-stained uniform from 1870. He moved through our aid station as if he still belonged there, checking wounds with hands that had long since decayed to bone. The worst part was his face. It still held that look of desperate determination that all doctors wear when trying to save a hopeless case. Mitchell's account describes how Laurent examined their modern medical supplies with an almost childlike wonder. He picked up our penicillin, our plasma bags, studying them with such longing. When he looked at me, his hollow eyes held such guilt, such pain. We could have saved so many, he whispered, if we'd had these. Then he turned to our wounded and reached for his ancient instruments. That's when the screaming started. The night of January 23rd marked the largest mass disappearance of the war. 37 wounded men vanished from Mitchell's aid station, along with all of Laurent's outdated medical supplies. But it was Private James Kelly's testimony that revealed the true horror of what the Phantom Doctor was attempting. I was wounded, but conscious, Kelly reported from his hospital bed, where he lay recovering after somehow escaping the phantom ambulance. Dr. Laurent's hands were so cold as he examined my wound. He kept apologizing, saying they had to keep trying, had to find a way to save everyone. The old woman's curse, he muttered. It wasn't what we thought. We wanted to save them all, but now we can't let them die. They suffer forever under our care. Kelly's description of the ambulance's interior haunted the investigators. Rows of men on stretchers, wounds from every battle ever fought here, all being eternally operated on by doctors who lost their humanity 50 years ago. They're trapped in an endless surgery, forever being saved, but never healing. I saw men I knew had died months ago, still conscious, still screaming. When Laurent turned to prep his instruments, I rolled off the stretcher and crawled away. I could hear him calling after me, begging me to let him help. "Please," he cried, "we must save them all." The British High Command finally authorized desperate measures. Major William Harrison, a decorated veteran who'd seen his share of horrors in colonial campaigns, assembled a special unit for one purpose: to stop Dr. Laurent's eternal rounds. Their mission was classified at the highest level, but fragments survived in Harrison's personal diary, discovered decades later in his grandson's attic. February 2nd, 1917. Consulted with local priest about consecrated items. Harrison wrote, "The old man crossed himself when I mentioned Laurent's name. Said his grandfather treated wounded in 1870. Told him stories of a doctor who made a deal with dark forces to save his patients. The price was his humanity, and theirs." Harrison's force consisted of 15 hand-picked men, each chosen for their medical experience as well as combat skills. They set their trap in a natural depression near Courcelette, using real wounded men who volunteered despite knowing the risks. The fog rolled in right on schedule, and with it came the dreaded sound of the brass bell. Private Albert Reed, one of only 3 survivors, described what happened in his sealed testimony. Dr. Laurent appeared first, his ancient medical bag in one hand, stethoscope still draped around what remained of his neck. He moved like a man possessed, rushing to the wounded as if 50 years hadn't passed. When Major Harrison called out for him to stop, Laurent looked up with those hollow eyes and spoke 4 words that haunt me still: "They need our help." The unit's weapons proved useless. Bullets passed through the phantom medical team as they methodically went about their rounds. But that wasn't the worst part, Reed continued, his hands shaking as he gave his statement. The worst was watching Laurent work. His surgical technique was perfect, even with his skeletal hands. He kept apologizing to the men as he treated them, explaining that the pain was necessary, that they would be saved forever. When Thompson tried to pull him away from a patient, Laurent's face, God help me, his face showed nothing but concern for the wounded man. "Please," he begged, "let me finish. I can save him. I can save them all." Major Harrison made a final attempt to reach the phantom doctor, appealing to his medical oath. I heard the major telling Laurent that he was causing more suffering than relief, Reed reported, that sometimes letting go was the greatest mercy. Laurent stopped his work then, his skeletal hands hovering over a wounded man's chest. For a moment, I thought we'd reached him, but then he looked up, and in his hollow eyes, I saw 50 years of guilt and determination. "You don't understand," Laurent said, his French accent thick with emotion. "We took an oath. First, do no harm. If we stop, if we let them die, all these years of keeping them alive will have been for nothing. We must keep trying." We must find a way to truly save them. The ambulance appeared then, rolling silently through the fog. The back doors opened to reveal rows of stretchers extending impossibly deep into the vehicle, each holding a patient caught between life and death. Some had been there since 1870, their uniforms rotting while their wounds remained forever fresh under the phantom doctor's eternal care. Harrison ordered a bayonet charge in a final, desperate attempt to stop them. As his men closed in, Laurent turned to them with an expression of infinite sadness. "Please," he whispered, "don't interfere with their treatment. They're all my patients now." After Harrison's failed mission, the British Army made one final attempt to understand what they were dealing with. In March 1917, Private James Whittaker of the 179th Tunneling Company broke through into an older tunnel system while excavating new defensive positions. What they found there was documented in a report that remained classified until 1998. "It was like stumbling into hell's own field hospital," Whittaker wrote in his statement. "The tunnel opened into a vast underground ward, lit by ancient lanterns that cast more shadow than light. The air was thick with the smell of ether and rotting uniforms. But the patients, dear God, the patients." Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a field surgeon called to examine the site, provided the most comprehensive account. The ward contained men from every battle ever fought on these fields. French soldiers from 1870 lay beside our boys from last week's assault. Their wounds were as fresh as the day they received them. But the men themselves, they existed in a state of perpetual dying, forever being operated on, but never finding peace. But the true revelation came from a leather-bound journal found clutched in the hands of one of Laurent's original orderlies. The final entries revealed the terrible price of their attempt to save lives. August 15th, 1870. The old woman in the village warned us about the price of the ritual. "If you use this magic to prevent death," she said, "you must become death's doctors forever." We didn't listen. How could we? The wounded screamed so loudly, begged us so desperately for help. We thought we could outsmart the curse, find a way to truly heal them once we had stopped them from dying. We were wrong. August 16th, 1870. The spell worked, but not as we hoped. Our patients cannot die, but neither can they heal. We are bound to them now, forced to operate eternally on wounds that will never close. Our medical oaths have become our damnation. We cannot stop trying to save them, even though we know it's impossible. The ambulance appears wherever soldiers die, compelling us to collect more patients for our endless surgeries. My hands have rotted away, but still they cut and stitch. Laurent's heart has turned to dust, but still it breaks for every man we save. August 17th, 1870. If you find this, burn our ambulance. Collapse these tunnels. Let our patients finally die. We meant well, but we have created something worse than death, an eternity of being saved, but never healing, of being treated, but never cured. The road to hell truly is paved with a doctor's good intentions. The British Army sealed the tunnel immediately, but they couldn't seal away the truth. Throughout the remainder of the Great War, the Phantom Ambulance continued its rounds. Even today, a century later, fog still rolls across the preserved battlefields of the Somme, and in that fog, they say you can sometimes hear the hollow toll of a brass bell. In 2014, during the Somme centenary commemorations, an elderly British Army doctor visited the memorial. As evening mist crept across the old trenches, he reported seeing a figure in an ancient French medical uniform making his rounds. The phantom was checking the vital signs of men who weren't there, the doctor reported. His hands were skeletal, his uniform rotted, but his medical technique, it was perfect. He looked up at me with hollow eyes and asked if I could spare any morphine. "We've been trying to ease their pain for so long," he said, "but nothing works. We must keep trying. We took an oath." The doctor's curse continues. Somewhere beneath the Somme, in chambers that exist somewhere between life and death, Dr. Laurent and his team are still making their rounds. Their patients lie on endless rows of stretchers, forever being saved by doctors who lost their humanity, but never their dedication to medicine. The brass bell still tolls on foggy nights, calling the phantom ambulance to collect more wounded for their eternal ward, where treatment never ends and healing never comes. If this tale from the War Maestro's archive chilled your soul, take a moment to join our collection of darkness. Next time you hear a bell in the fog, make sure it's not hollow, and subscribe to uncover more haunting military histories. Ring that notification bell, though perhaps not one made of brass, to know when our next classified file emerges from the mist. Share this story with those who understand that sometimes the most terrifying acts come from the best intentions. Leave a comment below. Have you ever encountered medical equipment that seemed to have a will of its own? Or perhaps you have your own tale of battlefield mercy gone wrong to share? Remember, some patients are still waiting to be saved.